Hey, Birchouse friends, welcome back. So today's question comes to us from Jeff Hilliard, who asks, "Hey, Birchouse, do you prefer historically accurate or historically modified arms?" This is a really good question. I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that, but I am going to answer it. We're going to take a few different avenues of discussion to answer this question. So hopefully by the end I've answered the question you wanted me to answer. And I'll try and keep it as succinct as possible. So I personally prefer historically accurate arms and armor. But I guess it kind of comes down to intent. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And the best example I can give is the company Cold Steel has a product called the Thompson Saber. And essentially, they have married the 1904 pattern Austrian saber hilt to a modified 1796 light cavalry saber blade to create their own sword. And the intent, and quote from Lynn Thompson, who owns Cold Steel, and this is his design, is he wanted to have a true sword fighter's blade for the modern martial artist. I had to write that quote down. That's why I'm looking off the side there. And I think that seems kind of silly. One, I don't know about you, but I don't get in sword duels very often. It just isn't necessary to have a sword for the modern martial artist. Secondly, I think there is a level of arrogance in thinking that you know better, that you can design a better sword than people who lived in a time where that was a tool that was a necessary component to their day-to-day lives. Sword designs vary wildly across centuries and across cultures. And I always say that, the best sword is the sword for the people and the time period that it existed in. And I just think that, you can look back, there are so many great sword designs, to think that you can come up with one that is better in a modern era where we have literal thousands of years of sword history to look back on. And especially in a time period where we don't use swords in our day-to-day lives. We just don't. The only people who are using swords in their day-to-day lives are people who do things like HEMA. And they are using historical swords and historical sword techniques. So, if the intent is to better history, I think that is a wrong-headed idea. However, having said that, I don't think that's an inherently bad idea. Once again, I think it comes down to intent. If you say you're wanting to make a movie or some piece of media, a video game or something, and you're wanting to make, this fantasy setting, but you want to kind of ground it in some kind of realism, marrying a couple different designs of real historical swords together to make your own design, I think is a really good way to have a fantasy sword that has a foot in reality, that has a foot in history, has an anchor in history. I think that's very good. I think that's very cool. If you're doing it for purely aesthetics, I like this hilt, I like this blade, I like this handle, this guard, whatever. I like this blade. I wish it was a little less steeply curved. If you're doing it for purely aesthetics, I think that's okay. I think having a historically modified sword because that's how you want it, I think that's okay. So I think it comes down to intent. What is the intent? Let's talk about another like historically accurate versus historically modified for a moment. And I brought along with me a World War II era Mosin Nagant 3-line rifle. This one is dated 1942. Almost certainly saw service during World War II with the Soviet Army. Now, this is in pretty much in the condition that I got it in, other than keeping it clean between shooting and all that. Now, I'm not deep into gun culture by any way, shape, or form, but I do see these occasionally looking like this. These are modified parts put on a 3-line rifle. To modify something that is historical, once again, I just think, there are a lot of modern rifles that are wildly customizable. I'm not sure why you would do it to a historical firearm. Boys and girls, don't modify antiques. And that's what these are. They're antiques. They are from a time period. Don't modify antiques. I think that's a really distasteful way of handling arms and armor of antiquity. So, you think about like things like armor in the Met. They don't modify them. They do their best to curate them and keep them as close to their original form as possible. So, do I prefer historical or historically modified arms and armor? Well, I have here a Shamshear. This is by Windlass Steelcrafts. To my knowledge, it is not based on a museum find or museum recreation, part of a museum collection or anything like that. It's not recreated from some archaeological artifact, but it is a pretty classic Shamshear. So you could say it's modified in that it's not based on anything in particular, on one particular example, but it is that classic Shamshear design, that steeply curved blade, that pretty distinct hilt pattern with crossguard. So, I own a few swords like this that aren't based on any real one example, but they are classic forms of that type of sword or arm. But I also own a lot more of these, things like this. This is a arming sword. It's a recreation of one that is in the Wallace collection. It has that really distinct Type 15 blade. And I own a lot more swords and arms of this nature where they are direct recreations of real swords, or they're based on an example of a sword that exists. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, I prefer historically accurate arms and armor. Jeff, that was a great question. I hope I answered that. I tried to answer it to the best of my ability. But either way, thank you for asking. Let's draw a question for next week. Next week's question comes from Frederick Mack. We will answer this question next week, Frederick. If you ever have a question for Birchouse, comment below with "Hey Birchouse," ask, and we'll answer in a future video. In the meantime, we'll see you all next Wednesday.
Welcome to Birchouse, where history meets art with due diligence.